I recently got Canon's flagship camera, the mirrorless R3, which comes in with an incredible 30 frames per second for photography, making it one of the top line sports cameras out there. How you all doing? My name is John and I'm a photographer, and like many of you, I live in the world of photography, videography, and various social media platforms. If you're interested in seeing some of my work, here's a bunch of the different platforms you can find me on. I mainly post on Instagram. I'm trying to get more in the habit of using Twitter and LinkedIn and some of the other platforms out there, but as you all know, it's so time consuming trying to do all of them every single day at once. So I mainly just focus on my sports photography because I'm doing that every single day for work in general. So you can find most of my work on my sports page, and I'll occasionally post on my other platforms just to try to be in the habit of constantly using everything as today's world always demands. This video may end up being a lot longer than I originally thought it might be, and probably way too long for what you want to get out of it. So I'm going to break this down into chapters, and make sure you check out the timestamp below so you can skip to the chapter you want to listen to. I'm going to be talking about a handful of sports games that I shot, progressing through various features of autofocus that the R3 has, because I'm trying to figure out which one I like the best. And the goal is that today you have more insight on the R3, because you're probably also researching it for yourself if it's worth even upgrading to, or you might be looking at it to just improve your photography in general. So it's definitely worth checking out which part of the video you want to skip to. I appreciate it if you want to listen to the whole thing, but this is going to be a very time-consuming video where I'm trying to break down some of the features, how they handle in different environments, what I like the best, which ones I'd want to lean to in various games, and so on. At the end, I'm going to do a giant overview section. So if you want to just skip to that to save some time, feel free, but then you'll miss out on all the photography in the middle. This is your R3 at a glance. It's got your nice horizontal grip, and it's got a nice texture to it, so it feels very comfortable in your hand. Since it's a larger body, you can always flip it to go vertical. It's got a built-in button down here for your shutter. You've got a dial for your shutter speed, and you've got your natural M/FM button if you want to rotate a few different preset camera settings you've got. On the back, you've got all the classic buttons you need for your camera, a handful of buttons to view your images, the on-off switch, a dial for your aperture, and then you've got a nice thumbstick up here to control different settings as you're going through your camera. So overall, it's a nicely built camera and fits very nicely in your hand. And the texture they've added to it just naturally feels comfortable while holding it all day long. Before I really dive into this video, I just want to go over a few terms that you just might want to be aware of as I'm talking about the different camera settings. If you're used to doing a lot of sports photography already, you're going to know what I'm talking about, but this is just for a few minutes for the people that don't know what that is. So to go over it, I threw my 70-200 on, which is the lens I used most to photograph these games. So the first setting you want to know about is called Servo. Now this is a focus mode setting. So to switch to it, you're going to turn your camera on. You're going to hit the little Q button, or you're going to tap it on your screen. You're going to see in the top left corner, it will say either one shot or a servo. You're going to click on that. You're going to make sure you're on servo. Now what this setting basically is, wherever the focus point on your camera is set, that's what's going to be in focus as you're tracking it through your scene. But whatever you're going to be taking a photo of, whatever you point your camera at, wherever that focus point is, that's what's going to be in focus in your frame. Now the other one is one shot. That's mainly used for still photography. Kind of allows you to set a focus point and then move your frame holding that focus. Totally different focus mode. You don't really use it a lot in sports, but you can, but we're not going to focus on that one today. Another few terms I'm going to be talking about is expanded area versus single point. So you're going to go to the back of your camera, you're going to hit this little Q box to open up the dialog again. The top left, you're going to see AF with a square. That's short for autofocus point. So the two that I like to go back and forth between is expanded area, which is going to be the box with 4 little boxes, top, bottom, left, and right. This is going to be telling my camera I want this spot in focus, but if my subject goes top and bottom or left and right of that box, it's still going to maintain that focus. The other one I like to use is just a single box, which says 1.AF. This is telling my camera I want this one specific point in focus and nothing else around it, or just trying to track that one specific point to make sure that that's always going to be in focus versus the stuff that's happening surrounding that box. So two other terms you want to be aware of is subject tracking and eye tracking. These sound super similar, but they're very different settings in your camera. So I'm going to hit menu. I'm going to go to where it says AF at the top. On this camera, it's the second menu. It's purple. It says AF literally at the top. I'm going to be under menu 1. And in this, you're going to see subject tracking, and you can either select it to be on or off. So that's telling your camera to either pick a subject in its focus and try to track that subject throughout the scene instead of focusing on the individual point that you'd rather set up. And the other one is eye detection. So this is basically telling your camera to track the eye of your subject or just track the subject as a whole. Now, a lot of the times when you're trying to track athletes, it can be a little bit more difficult, but typically you always want the face in focus when you're photographing athletes. So I leave eye tracking on most of the time, just so that if I'm getting a shot, the face is going to be in focus, but maybe something else is out of focus, but you always want an in focus face in sports photography. So subject tracking again is tracking the subject throughout the frame of your camera. And eye tracking is basically telling your camera to really just focus on the face as it's tracking your subject in your camera. Okay, so we got a real tight shot right here because the next thing we're going to talk about is eye control. So eye control is a new feature that a lot of the top-end mirrorless cameras have. And it's this feature that allows you to track your subject using your eye in the viewfinder, but it only really works if your eye is actually up to the viewfinder like this. And what happens is a little yellow circle pops up, and wherever your eye is focused in your viewfinder, that yellow circle is going to jump to. And then you can say, I want my focus point to be here because I'm looking there. Select that area as your focus point, and you can keep it right there or track the subject that you selected with your eye through the frame. So really cool to use. I basically bounce back between that and no tracking because those are the two main features that this camera was really demonstrating that's worth talking about in this video. So eye control is super cool, allows for a lot of creativity, which I'm going to be getting into shortly. Another term you want to be aware of is cases. Cases is different autofocus settings Canon has set up that you can jump back and forth between depending on what your subject is doing or what sport or what action your subject is actually participating in. So when you go to your menu, you're going to go to autofocus box 2. You're going to see cases 1, 2, 3, 4, and auto. So cases 1, 2, 3, and 4 are all set up for different scenarios that your subject might be doing. Now this is really built into what kind of sport it might be, if it's a sport that's moving in a linear direction, or if it's a sport where it's going back and forth. There are different settings where the subject you choose, you can tell your camera to stay on that subject even if something else pops into frame in the spot you're tracking, or to instantly bounce to the first subject that pops into the area that you're focused in. For example, you might want to track a subject like a basketball player for a little bit longer when they're weaving through other players versus a cycling race where you want to make sure you're kind of just focused on the biker that's in the very front sort of scenario. So a lot of times I keep it on auto because that's the one I like the best when I've been experimenting with it. But if you're in a specific sport or one has an advantage over the other, definitely try jumping to it and experimenting with that as well. For this video, I had 5 different basketball games to cover, a football game, and a volleyball game. So I know it's primarily basketball, but it's basketball season right now. But I made sure in each quarter or half to switch back and forth between different settings, so that way you could get a full picture of what I was seeing while I was taking my images. Some of these images may be edited, which were the final ones that I sent off for social media or for news usage, and others are going to be unedited, which are going to be the bad examples, mainly not because of the edits themselves, but just of the composition and what was happening. So I'd rather show you guys the actual full frame of what I was getting versus trying to crop it to show a specific angle. So you kind of get a more full picture of what I was actually getting with this camera versus a very cropped specific complaint in general. Now there are going to be some bursts thrown in there. Because this camera can take 30 frames per second, there are a few moments where I just held down the shutter so you could kind of see what I was getting as I was taking bursts throughout the games. Houston's men's basketball home opener versus Northern Colorado was the first chance I got to really test out my R3. So I threw on a 70-200 because that's one of your typical lenses you'll use at a basketball game. And I kind of kept it on the default settings out of the box just to see what it could do without fiddling with it too much. And the default settings aren't really what I normally use, but I just wanted to see how awesome this camera was. So that setting was Servo with subject detect, people focused with subject tracking, and I threw on expanded area as my autofocus point. So what I was basically telling the camera was, here's the autofocus point in the center that I want to start my focus on, and once it finds the subject that I want to track, continue to track that subject throughout the frame. So throughout the game, I got some awesome layup shots, I got some driving to the basket shots, and I was even able to get some up close tight portrait shots of some of the cheerleaders behind me, the coach as he was talking to some of his players, and just a whole around awesome set of photos to use to tell the entire story. But at the end of the game, there's a point where one player is driving towards the net and your typical ref in the way shot happened, and it blew me away how fast the camera actually went from focusing on the player to the misfocus on the ref to snapping back to the player before he was even about to make his initial shot. Now, of course, the player missed the shot, but what caught me was how quickly this camera snapped back to actually being in focus on the player, making the pivotal key moment, which is what you'd want in the camera to do. So initially, this was a just see how this camera shoots kind of game, but I was blown away compared to the cameras I've been previously using with what the R3 could actually do. The second game was Houston's men's basketball versus Oral Roberts, another home game in the Fertitta Center. And this time I decided to change up the settings between the first half and the second half. So the first half was the traditional setting, which I shoot all my sports with typically, is Servo, no subject tracking, using expanded area, and keeping it a center point focus in a sense. So that way, whatever is directly in front of my camera is what I'm trying to focus on as I'm taking the image. In the first half, I was able to get some awesome portraits, some game shots, just a variety of your typical basketball images, just getting these nice, clear, crisp shots with the R3. One of the first bursts that I got while photographing this game was one of our point guards stealing a pass, driving to the hoop and making a score. And you really got to see how many images this camera can take in fractions of a second, and how many awesome images you actually get from a whole burst, while seeing how fast it can actually lock onto the subject and follow through the motion. Now, a lot of this does have to deal with make sure that you can keep yourself focused on the subject as it's going through the frame, but this camera did a great job of tracking through the whole motion of completing the basket. This second burst is a quick little burst of one of our big guys initially with the ball and going up for a basket. Didn't make it, but this is just quickly showing how fast it can go from being in focus to something causing it to go out of focus like another player, and then snapping back to the player you actually want the image to be focused on. With the good must come some bad. Now with this way of shooting, if you're focused on a point guard at the top of the court, you might end up having another player come in front of you, cutting off your focus and shifting your focus to that player's leg instead of the point guard you want the action to be focused on. Another unfortunate scenario is your player could also be at the top of the court with other various players in front of them between you and the player you're focused on. And then you can get a long set of arms to go in between you and your player, and they could be going right through your focus point, so your camera shifts to the player's arm instead of trying to stay focused on the player you were tracking initially. So that is the one downside when you're not using any sort of subject tracking while you're shooting. Two bursts that really highlight this issue is, one, I've got a player going up for a jump shot, and the Oral Roberts defender kind of drifts in front of him and steals the focus of my camera as I'm trying to focus on our player shooting the jumper. And another one is one of our big men, he's going up for another shot, and unfortunately we've got other defenders getting in front of him as he's going up for the shot, so the focus unfortunately drifts away from him and to the other players. For the second half of this game, I really wanted to test out eye control. So my settings for the second half of this particular match was Servo with eye control, subject tracking, expanded area as my main kind of style of focus. So what this setting is really awesome for is really creating storytelling shots. And especially in basketball, a lot of the times you have a one-on-one kind of image with the defender guarding the individual with the ball. So with eye tracking, instead of having to focus one of them directly in the center of the frame, you can now push the two to be evenly separated in the frame So that way you have one on one side of the image and one on the other side as well. And then you can also do fun shots with focusing one player on one side of the image. For example, if you got a player dribbling a ball along the sideline, you can now kind of show them on one part of the frame with the rest of the court kind of off to the left. Or maybe you can have them on one part of the frame while seeing what the other players are doing on the opposite side to just kind of give you more of a story within that one image itself. A good burst kind of demonstrating the ability of this camera to really track your subject while you're using this kind of method was a nice back and forth maneuver of one of our point guards weaving in and out of players and then going up for a shot and staying in focus the whole time as he's going for the basket. Another good burst is the same player going up for a jumper, but I've got him positioned more towards the right of the frame so that I can also include the defenders trying to jump up and block him at the same time while still composing a good image of the actual shot itself. So as cool as eye control is, there always is a few hiccups with it. For example, a lot of the times when a player makes a shot and it rebounds off and 10 guys jump for the ball, the camera is only going to focus once you actually pick a focus point in the image. So sometimes you'd be trying to search for that actual focus point. And for this example, in this image, the first thing I looked at was one of the big men standing underneath the rim. And I missed the focus on the actual player rebounding it and going up for a second shot. So it's kind of blurry in the background, but it still is a cool storytelling shot because you kind of get a point of view shot of the player watching his teammate go for a shot. But when you're trying to get peak action images, this isn't going to really cut it for this actual scenario. So this could be a good supporting shot you're using later. But if you're really trying to go for that prime in focus shot of the moment, this setting can struggle just a tad. In this burst, that little bit of a delay factor is highlighted as our point guard makes a pass to another player and that player goes up for a jump shot. There's a slight delay in me being able to get my eye to jump to the other player and lock in that focus before he makes that prime point of the moment before he goes to make the shot. So there are a few frames from focus towards the end, but the main pivotal part, I didn't get super in focus because I was trying to jump from player to player with the eye control focus. Another fun burst to play around with is when our cheerleaders are actually doing little tumbles throughout the court during timeouts or halftime. In this first one, as I'm trying to track the cheerleader as she's doing somersaults or flips throughout the course, another cheerleader comes into frame, steals the focus from her, and I kind of lose her as she's continuing to do her circles. And then in this much longer one, I was able to track the cheerleader for a lot longer as she's flipping throughout the course. And what I kind of noticed is there's a set amount of frames that the camera will try to keep your subject in focus if it loses your subject at first. Whereas if it can quickly see your subject again as you're bursting through images, it will maintain that focus. But in the prior shorter one, if a full another subject comes in the frame completely blocking off your initial subject, your camera will go, oh, that subject doesn't exist anymore, I can't see it for too long, and will lose focus. So that's one key thing to notice while you're trying to use eye tracking or subject tracking control as you're taking bursts of images of your subjects. Game 3 was women's basketball versus Texas A&M Commerce. So for the first half of this game, I did my standard continuous Servo, expanded area, no tracking. So whatever is in the center of my image is what's going to be in focus. And you get your classic center focus shots of free throws, coaches, the center of my frame for warm-ups is going to be in focus. Just anything I'm pointing at, the very thing in the center is going to be the focus subject of the image. I've got 3 quick bursts from the first half just to show you. They're all layups of different players driving to the hoops at different points, but it's another good example of center focus just basically locking on to what I want to be in focus. But this is really done by me making sure that as my subject is moving, I'm taking my camera and making sure that it's tracking the subject and I'm keeping it directly in the middle of my frame as I go. Here are some misfires. Your typical, there's other subjects in front of the subject I want in focus, or something's happening where the subjects go away from the center of the frame and your camera might jump to a different part of the picture to keep that in focus. So it's just kind of like a whole mess. And then other times is if you're trying to do a nice portrait from the side, your center point of focus will lock on to what's in the center. So sometimes you can get a nice shot of Their hair and their ear are in focus, but the most important part, which is their eyes, are out of focus. So this is something you have to be aware of when you're using this kind of focus method, but you can always mess around with a thumb pad and move that focus point if you have enough time to. This is usually best when subjects aren't moving quickly or you're far enough away where the subject moving through the frame, you can also kind of track with your finger and the thumb pad. Now, the negative of this kind of style is that if you're tracking a subject in the center of your frame, if another subject runs in front of it, you're going to lose focus on your main subject because your camera's going to want to snap to what's directly in front of it. For the second half of this game, I was using Servo, subject tracking, and eye control. So I was using my eye to try to track subjects throughout the frame. And I was messing with the cases, and I jumped to case 2 because from Canon's description, felt like it might be good using in basketball. So again, what I was doing was trying to keep my subject on one part of the frame so that what they were looking at or where they were going, you could kind of see in the other part of the frame. And what I have noticed is this is a real good kind of method to try to get a subject focused between a whole set of players and not have to worry about other players running back and forth, stealing the focus from the subject you're looking at. To go through the bursts from the second half, this first one is a jumper shot of one of our players. So at first I lose her because she goes through a whole series of other defenders, but then my camera could snap right back to her before she makes that apex shot. In this second burst, I just had a player going underneath the basket and making a pass to another player to get another shot off. So in this series, I was able to keep focus on the player as she's making the pass, switch focus to the player making a shot, and then switch my focus back to the players as they're trying to rebound for the ball. In this third sequence, I've got our player driving to the net, going in and out between defenders and going up for the layup. Been able to keep her in focus in my frame the whole time, and just it allows me to be able to use any of these little moments as my final image if I need be. So this is another good example of eye control doing a great job of helping me compose the frame to basically frame the subject on one part instead of always having her framed in the middle. In addition to using those eye tracking controls for the second half, I wanted to mess with the cases a little bit. So I switched to case 2, which seems like it might do well for basketball because it's meant to track a subject and ignore potential obstacles. After a few minutes of using case 2, I felt that it was still locking onto the subjects, but was jumping around a little bit more than I wanted it to. The obstacles I might have referred to that it doesn't track or it kind of ignores might have not included people because I felt like it was still kind of popping around from person to person more than I wanted it to. So after a few minutes, I switched to case 4. After switching to case 4, it still did a great job of selecting the subject that I wanted, tracking them in the part of the frame I wanted them to stay on with everything else going around them in the other part of the frame. I was able to get a nice drive towards the basket, the player starting a dribble on one side on the opposite part of the frame, while also being able to maintain focus on a jump shot as they're in the center. And then in the one burst I have in case 4 is one of our first initial images of the player driving towards the basket from left to right without losing focus on her throughout the whole frame. So the one crutch I do find with this setting when I'm using eye control is if the ball comes back down, if the shot is missed and you're trying to get that perfect rebound, if you can't figure out which player to focus on quickly enough, you're going to get an out of focus shot where you might not get the right player, or you might be getting the background in focus and you get a nice big blurry image of the players fighting for the ball. The next game on the list was another men's basketball game. This one was against Texas Southern University. So as always, the first half I shot with my control, but I switched to just single point focus because I was noticing in basketball as I was shooting these games, I liked to have a more narrow field of focus for my focus control point, just because there's a lot of times in basketball where your subject gets closed in on by other players. And I just wanted to make sure that where I was focusing directly with my camera was what was in focus, because I didn't want it to keep losing focus on the other players either coming closer to my subject or kind of cutting in front of them in a sense. So with my regular straightforward point and shoot kind of focus style, Servo, no subject tracking, got a handful of great shots of the players, especially pivotal points of layups or a point guard coming down the court, a jump shot, and also just the Amex of a dunk when your player is about to just slam the ball into the basket. And I also have a handful of bursts to show from this first half as well. This first burst is a little jumpy, but that's just because there's some images I'm not taking, because since I know I've got center point focus, if I can easily see that there's another player about to just take up the subject, I'm not going to fire because I don't want to fire off another 60 images with how fast this camera shoots. No, I'm not going to get in focus. So I kind of wait until I know the subject is going to be mainly the center point of focus before I follow up for the basket, which this camera does a beautiful job of maintaining that focus point that you're directly centered on. The second burst is another series of one of our players fighting through opposing players and going up for a nice jump shot while maintaining that field of focus throughout the shot. And even if I do lose him out being from the center, the camera did still do a pretty good job of keeping that center field of focus as the ball goes off towards the basket. This third burst shows why it's really awesome using a center point of focus for basketball, because as the player weaves through defenders, you have other guys jumping up and down around them, which in theory could potentially try to steal focus from the camera if it's trying to keep multiple points in focus like it does in expanded area. So using the single point allowed me to follow this player through traffic as he goes up to try to make a score without losing focus on the other players around him. This fourth burst shows one of our players going up for a dunk, and it's the classic and dreaded, the ref is about to get in my shot kind of burst. But what's great about using single point is that it keeps a narrow field of focus as I'm tracking the player. So as he goes up for the dunk, you can see the ref coming in to get in the way, but it maintained focus on the player I was tracking versus instantly jumping to the ref as he was coming into my field of focus. So for the second half, I switched back to subject tracking with eye control so I can make sure that I could follow my subject, but starting with where I was tracking them with my eye, same with that single point focus to try to keep it nice and narrow. So going through this, I was able to get more shots where I could make sure that my subject was in focus on one side of the frame and you could kind of see what he was looking at on the court, while also making sure I could get shots of the point guard coming down the court with the defender looking at him as he's making a gesture to the rest of his team with what kind of play they're about to run, while also getting a jump shot with my player focused on the right side of the frame and the defender lunging at him from the left, kind of giving you a nice evenly composed shot where one player isn't right dab in the center and the other player is awkwardly not balanced next to him. Another image which I've been noticing is a lot easier to get with eye control on is being able to get this nice, really just tense, tight shot of the point guard or player at the top of the court in focus as players between you and them get a little bit closer, kind of making this a nice framed composition of the players' bodies around your subject in focus. And since eye control is tracked on, as those players get closer, my focus is still stuck on the point guard at the top, and I'm not losing focus to the players making a narrow kind of pathway to the actual subject. Going through another set of bursts, I've got this first one of our player going from one side of the court to the center and making a jump shot, which using eye control and tracking, it kind of allowed you to track him instead of losing him in the mass of subjects. I was able to keep him in focus as he moves along the court and goes up for the jump shot. In this second burst, after our breakaway pass, our player stole the ball and was driving down the court to make a dunk. And using eye tracking, I was able to make sure that he started on the right side of the frame and got a nice composition of him running towards me, going up for the dunk, which I had him centered, and then coming down. It kind of gives you a nice sense of space throughout these series of images as he's coming in for the final shot. In this third burst, eye control does a really good job of tracking the player as I'm kind of struggling to fight for control of the ball, and then turning and making a quick jump shot, which kind of allows me to keep the basket centered in frame so you know what he's doing and where he is, while also keeping him in focus on the right side of the frame as he goes up for an attempt at a basket. So in this fourth burst, I get an image where the player is starting making a drive for the basket. Now, as you can kind of tell, I really don't get much of a shot here, but the key thing that sticks out is as the referee comes in, which always happens a lot and kind of gets in the way of the shot, it doesn't lose focus and stick to the referee. It still kind of maintains focus on the player as he's making the shot and finishing it, which is huge. If you don't get that main shot, you can still go to the player and get that actual reaction from the shot, because that's still going to be an awesome photo to have in your portfolio. So the fifth game was women's basketball versus Florida State. And this is gonna sound a little messy and jargony, so give me a second. So a lot of the times when you're shooting basketball, you're shooting from one spot. So I shot from one spot for the first half, but changed up my settings for the first and second quarter, and shot from a different spot the second half, but changed up my settings for the third and fourth quarter. So for the first and third quarter, I shot with your traditional Servo, center point of focus, no tracking. And for the second and fourth quarter, I use subject tracking with eye control. So for the first and third quarter, using center point of focus, my subject that's going to be in the center is going to remain in focus. Or if they move slightly off center, but my camera still kind of keeps that plane of focus on them, they'll be the main point of the shot. So like jump shots, layups, passes, as long as I'm pointed directly at my subject, they'll be in focus. But as always, if your main subject that's in focus is in the center, you could have a case where other subjects in between you and your original subject come in and steal the focus of what you're actually trying to get a shot of. A lot of times this can happen in free throws where at first the players are spaced out so you can get a nice in-focus shot of the free throw shooter. And then those players get a little bit tighter and cause you to lose focus, making your focus go to the players standing in line, or just everything is out of focus because your camera goes, I don't know what to look at. Now, a lot of the times when your camera misfires and doesn't know what to focus on, you get this, what I find to be beautiful, but everything is super blurry, kind of vocal kind of looking shot. A lot of times these get thrown away because you can't use these to post or do any kind of news story with. But I always like to keep mine as like an abstract collection that I post with occasionally. It's not your classic super sharp in focus sports photo, but I kind of like to use them as a collection of blurs when you're looking at them as a whole. Here's a burst from the second quarter when I was using eye control and subject tracking. I've got the player on the left going to the goal to make a layup. And unfortunately, even though it's a missed shot, I can still kind of keep her going up towards the basket with the basket in center. So that way it kind of tells a little bit more of a story of what's happening in this image, instead of just kind of getting lost in focus in a box around her without being able to tell where they are on the court. So in this quick burst from the third quarter, this is when I'm using your traditional Servo, no subject tracking, just focus on what's purely in center of my image. I've got the player driving towards the basket. We've got another player kind of getting in the way. We've got a ref about to get in the way. But since I'm using a single point kind of focus, I'm keeping focus on the player as she's driving to the basket. As the traditional issue with the shooting method is when you're using center point of focus with no subject tracking, the moment other subjects come between you and the subject you're kind of getting photos of, you will lose focus, unfortunately, but it will snap back quickly if your subject comes back into the frame without anything in between it. So that's just something you got to keep in mind as you're using this focus setting. As these two last bursts demonstrate, the first one being single point, Servo, no tracking, and the second one being single point, Servo, but with tracking and eye control. Each method can still get you a good result in a picture and a layup. Now I know both of these shots more misses, but really just focusing on the fact that I was able to track the subject I wanted it to, with it being in the center of the frame or off to the side of the frame, with each way I was shooting. So the end goal is to make sure you can still get a good shot with the method of focusing that you're using. So for my football game, it was Houston football versus Temple University. And since I only had one game to really kind of demonstrate what I could do with this camera, I basically cut it into four quarters for a football game, using different settings for each quarter. Now for the lens I was using a 100 to 400 EF lens with a converter. So I don't know if there is a theory or not, but if using a converter equals a slower reaction time for the camera, I have had moments where sometimes the adapter and the camera don't link up and can't sync and focus correctly, which is why I like using RF lenses better, because you don't have a converter with them. But this is still going to do great photos with this camera. But I just wanted to point that out just in case I'm not getting super in-depth photos as I would if I had an RF lens on my camera. So the photos I'm about to go through still turned out to be great, but I do have to put a little bit of that asterisk kind of addition in there just in case this would have done better with an RF lens. In this next set of shots, I didn't really hold down enough to get a real burst. But I'm just gonna kind of show you that it selected the quarterback before I had him start moving. And then as he's going, there's players and a referee that get between me and him. But the subject is still in focus as the camera maintains tracking on that subject as he runs out, and you can see that he's in focus when he gets to the other side of the referee. This next set of shots is a series of having to pan quickly, as starting on the quarterback, I watch him about to make the throw, and as he makes the throw, I quickly pan over to where the wide receiver is, and I'm able to quickly pick out the wide receiver from all the potential subjects in the frame and track him as he completes the catch and the play. For the second quarter is using the traditional way of shooting where it's Servo as using expanded area but no subject tracking, and keeping my point of focus in the middle. So whatever was going to be directly in front of my camera was going to be in focus, as you can kind of see in these few shots. But the one downside of this, again, as I mentioned in the basketball images, is once another subject gets in front of the subject that you're trying to focus on, your camera's focus will shift to the subject that's closer to you in the frame if it becomes directly in front of your composition, which can get a little annoying. That's just the thing you have to deal with this way of shooting. Just a few other quick examples of this. Sometimes you can get lucky where even if you have multiple subjects in the way of your center frame of focus, you can still keep your main subject, like the quarterback here, in focus as the ball is hiked. But other times when you're trying to make sure that the kicker, for example, is in focus here, you could lose focus once other defenders start running in front of him in the play as he's moving in the play and they're moving, trying to get in the way of his kick. So this is one of those things with this method of shooting. You just have to make sure that what you want to stay in focus, you have a clear path of seeing with your camera. For the third quarter of the game, I went up to the nosebleeds just to get a different angle of images for this whole game as a set. I really wanted to test out its ability to jump around with eye control and player tracking to the different parts of the composition, as I've got most of the 22 players in one whole focus kind of shot. So in this series of images, you can see that the quarterback starts with the ball, but then I'm able to jump to the other players as they catch the ball themselves or get the ball as they move through the whole composition. And I can make sure that as the player is moving, I'm tracking them with my eye to make sure that the camera keeps focus tracked on the individual player I want to remain the focal point of the image. In this burst of images from up top, as I can see the play is about to be a handoff, I can use my eye to make sure that the focus locks onto the running back and track that as he weaves through the players until he's eventually tackled at the end of the play. This method also works real nicely, as you can see in this series of images. As the quarterback senses the pockets collapsing around him and he makes a break for it, I'm able to just maintain my eye on the quarterback and keep tracking him as he runs up the field. I eventually made my way back down to field level, and in this quick little burst, you can see I was able to get my eye to track the running back as he makes a bunch of cuts, and there's a bunch of other subjects weaving in between. Since my subject was being tracked in the camera settings, I was able to maintain my focus on the running back as he's making the play until he gets tackled. What I was noticing, there is a downside with this method of focusing while you're trying to shoot a football game. And specifically, since there's 22 players on the field, and there's also subjects in the stands, so there's more faces, sometimes the software does struggle with picking out the exact player you want to remain in focus. And what I noticed is you do have to pan very quickly in football a lot when you're trying to start from the quarterback to the wide receiver. And what happens when you're panning, when you get to that final spot where you want to be, you still have to take a half a second to figure out where your subject is and you try to focus him. And by then the play could be over or you could be tackled or you're just gonna get an out of focus image, unfortunately. But even though it would be fun to just completely blame the camera for not being good enough, the camera still is really good with this sort of scenario. Because the reality is, if you start looking from the left and you try to pan quickly to the right, it's still gonna take you naturally about half a second to focus your eyes on what you actually wanna be focusing on after you go from left to the right. If you naturally wanna try doing it yourself a few times and pause the video, you'll get what I mean. Whereas if I start looking left and I quickly look to the right, it's gonna take me about a second to figure out what I wanna look at after moving my head. So you have to think about also doing that in the camera. So when you go from the left to the right real quickly, your eye is still gonna have to take half a second to figure out what you wanna look at in your composition before you're able to pick a focus point. And I do have a burst showing this dilemma where starting off, I got this really awesome composition of the quarterback looking for someone to throw the ball to as the offensive and defensive linemen move around him. But the wide receiver was a little too close to me, and so when I eventually panned him, I couldn't focus in time as he was crossing the goal line, and I got a nice focus shot of his back, and that's just kind of too late to use that image at all. Whereas if I was using a different focus method, I might have perhaps got the ability to focus on him a little bit more quicker if he was centered in frame and focus and I wasn't trying to use eye control or subject tracking. But who really knows? That could also have been the fact that I was trying to zoom in and out too quickly with the 400 at the same time. So it's hard to really gauge whose fault that really was, if it was me or the camera. But that also just happens all the time in football photography because you have to pan so quickly. It can be very hard sometimes to get the wide receiver perfectly centered and in focus during the climax of the catch or the touchdown itself. So for the fourth quarter, I'm still using a similar method where I was using Servo with subject tracking and eye control. I just switched my focus point from single point to expanded area to kind of see how that would react with eye tracking. Because a lot of times I will use expanded area in football just because I want to maintain the field, like a larger field of focus for my subject because the way they could be moving left or right at a distance. And what I would notice is you can still set up nice images with your subject on one side of the frame and get your subject looking at another point of interest. It allowed me to kind of get a shot with using the defensive line as they're kind of looking at each other, getting ready to pounce the offensive line as like a cool point of view focus of the defender. And then also just a cool shot of the kick returner on the right side of the frame, waiting for the kickoff that's happening on the left side of the frame, kind of giving you a full story of what's happening in one single image. And then also got some nice bursts of tracking the quarterback as he's kind of scrambling as the play's collapsing around him. Just because it was the fourth quarter, I was able to track the game-winning touchdown as it happened right in front of me. It just happened to be that the subject was in my center frame of focus, but it was a nice job watching the camera track the wide receiver, making the catch and going to the ground. Volleyball versus SMU. The seventh game I was able to mess around with the different camera settings with the R3. I switched back to a 70 to 200 because that's a much smaller court like basketball, where this is probably a perfect lens to shoot that match with. And because volleyball's in sets and not halves or quarters, the first set I shot using my standard Servo, no subject tracking, center point of focus, using a single point focus instead of expanded area as my main way of shooting. For set 2, I switched back to subject tracking with eye control just to see how that works in the sphere of volleyball. When I talk about set 1, there's 5 different spots along a volleyball court that I typically like to shoot from. So I'm going to be showing a few photos from each spot to just kind of show you what I'm getting using the settings I was using, and then doing the same 5 spots while using the same eye control settings for set 2, just to kind of show you what I'm getting with each spot with the settings I'm using for each focus mode. So for the first match, I was up against the front. Typically I'm aligned with the first line of players and I'm down kneeling so I can get some nice like high angle shots. So you can get a good set shot, you can get a good spike shot, and you always get good celebration shots here because I always celebrate closer to the net. And you can never really be super disappointed with the shots you get here when you're using basically point and look kind of focusing mode with your focus in the center. Every now and then you might miss a shot though. Spot 2 using the same focus method. I was getting a lot of celebration shots. Typically this spot I'm standing along the baseline where they typically serve the ball from, or kind of like the back line as they call it. For me, you can get some nice portrait shots of someone serving or celebration shots, or also just getting good reaction shots of the sideline as well. So I think the spot that works best with this camera setting when you're using a very centered forward focusing style is directly from the back, because this allows you to kind of see everything that's happening in front of you and move your camera along the court to make sure that you're lined up with what you need to get. So this could be from someone serving to your left or your right. This could be watching a player watch the ball go out of bounds. This could be getting a spike on the left side or a spike on the right side, or even a set directly down the middle if no one's standing in front of you. So I think this is when this focusing method really works its best. So the fourth sport, I'm usually standing a few rows up, a little bit more towards the beginning of the court. So that way I'm kind of in between the players in the front row and the back row, which kind of allows you to make sure that you keep the action directly centered in front of you, whether it comes to sets or spikes or even blocks happening right at the beginning of the net. So my fifth spot is from the opposite side of the court, looking at the team I'm photographing. Now you do have to be careful about this spot just because of the net that you have to deal with, but it was a good test to see if the camera would focus on the net or the players themselves. And using the focus mode I was on, the camera still did a really good job making sure that the subject you were looking at was the player and not the net in front of them. Now if you stand far enough back, you can still try to make sure that most of the action is still happening directly in the center of your frame, but you do have to have the occasional patience for when it doesn't work out. Just because when you've got the other team in front of you or even the net, like the side of the net, we've got a lot more going on versus just black mesh. You will occasionally lose focus, but typically you still get a good result from this spot. So like in all the other sports, there is a downside to using this focusing method occasionally. So when you're close up to the net, like I am in spot 1, if you have multiple subjects jumping up for the ball and you're trying to figure out where to look or even focus, you still can mess up and you can still have your camera lose track of what's happening in front of you. And then even if you move a little bit further down the court to kind of spot 2, if stuff is happening really fast in front of you and you can't really align your camera directly where you want it to be, you can still get a blurry out of focus shot. Or occasionally what happens is a referee is right in front of the server as you're trying to get a shot of the server. So you're not going to get a nice focus shot. You're probably going to get an out of focus shot or an awesome photo of the referee that you don't want. So really the only major downside of this kind of focusing mode is kind of when you're focusing from the opposite direction in spot 5 I was talking about earlier. When you're kind of shooting towards the team you're photographing, but from the other side of the net, there are some larger features of the net on the side, which the camera can get distracted by and lose focus as you're trying to get a nice shot of your player serving the ball. So it's just something you have to be aware of. But a lot of the times you can still make sure that you're focused on the player. Just move a little bit to your left or your right, and you can try to make sure that even using this focusing method, you still get focused shots of the player serving the ball and not the net. Even with the distractions, as I was just mentioning, you can still get your camera to snap back to the actual subject. That's why the R3 is super great. As you can quickly see, it kind of starts off out of focus because there's kind of too much going on, but the camera can quickly snap back to focus to the player as the serve is happening. And then in our second burst, as you can see, there's still the distractions going on with the thicker parts of white in the image, but since the player is mainly centered behind the mesh along the thinner strands of white, the camera does a great job of keeping its focus on the player and not getting distracted by the objects in front of her. To double down on that, in this third burst, we've got another serve, but the player stays in focus even though you've got another subject in front of her. And you're also dealing with the mesh of the net and the white strands in the net also getting in the way. The camera does a great job of keeping focus on the player that I want to as she serves the ball. In this fourth burst, I'm kind of standing in spot 2. But again, I've got a referee in the way and another player in the way that kind of steals the focus as my selected player is doing her serve. Now I have usable images in here that I can use and post later, but just to show you, this is the camera still kind of fighting to maintain control and focus, but the R3 still does a great job of making sure that the player that I want to stay in focus stays in focus throughout the motion, and really only loses his focus to another subject when the subject comes too close to the center of the frame where I was shooting. So the downside is more has to deal with the way I was focusing, not the camera itself, just the method I was shooting with a center point focus. So for match 2 or set 2 as you want to call it, I switched back to eye control with subject tracking just to see if I could kind of frame the volleyball players in a way to be a little bit more creative with the storytelling process. So from that same spot 1 where I'm super close to the net, I can get some really cool shots of basically rearranging the players in my composition so that they're all kind of centered and looking in one direction, which is always fun, especially when they're rebounding. It can be a little bit more difficult, but you can still get good shots of players spiking the ball directly in front of you. It can just be a little bit harder to quickly get that focus point when you've got multiple subjects in front of you that you need to make sure you lock onto. But then with rebounds or blocks, as you can call it, you can kind of position them on one side of the net or on one side of the composition. So you can see that they're making the block on the right side of the net versus just some vague spot in the middle. So from the second spot, when I'm a little bit further back, closer to that end line, you can still get great shots of the server lining her up on the left side of the frame while our team is watching her on the right side of the frame. But since you're panning a little bit more back and forth, it's harder to get really awesome shots because you're spending more time trying to lock on to the players that you want to see versus getting like really good crisp action shots. So I'd say this is one spot that the setting struggles from a little bit, but I think my favorite spot again is purely from behind. Now you don't want to sit here for the whole volleyball game or set of matches because you want to get shots of their faces, but when you're sitting from behind and you can use a wider kind of shot at 70 millimeters, you can still get good shots where you can make sure that you've got a server on the left, or you can get a rebound in the middle, or you can kind of frame the servers on the left or the right. Also make sure you kind of get a whole kind of action shot of someone spiking the ball down, when you can get the spike on the left and the reaction of the teammates and other players on the right, or vice versa if you get a nice shot on the right or block on the right and you've got players reacting to the left. And as always, it's always really awesome to kind of just set players on one side and get the rest of the team on the other to kind of just give you a nice, more full frame story of what's happening in that moment. When I'm in that fourth spot, I'm still getting good shots of kind of everything that's happening in front of me, still using my ability to frame and compose players on one part of the frame while action is happening on the other part of the frame or the reaction, such as like getting a block on the right side and players watching them on the left side, or just getting awesome celebrations as well. So it's very similar to spot number one, just a little bit further back and elevated. And since you're a little bit further back, it's easier to basically frame your subjects as actioning is happening in front of you. From that fifth spot, when I'm on the other side of the net, I think this focusing mode does very well because I can make sure I can frame my focus player in the part of the composition that I want, while all the distractions on the other side. Or I can make sure that I'm tracking my subject in the part of the frame I want them to, and I don't have to worry about the net or opposing players getting in the way. Now this kind of works with all facets of the game from this point, but there will be those moments where stuff is happening too quickly and you can't focus correctly. But when you're trying to get shots from this vantage point, I really think eye control really does most of the work here for you without having to worry about losing focus if something comes in the center of your image. To go through a few bursts, I've got this first burst where I'm at spot 5 on the opposite side of the net, and using eye control and subject tracking, I can make sure that I get some cool shots of my player serving the ball as she goes back and forth in between the obstacle of the net while she stays in focus. In the second burst, when I'm directly behind them, I can still keep the server in focus as she goes up to serve through the motion, keeping on the right side of the frame. So that way you can still get a good shot of the actual serve while seeing the reaction to the other players on the court on the left side of the image. In this third burst, I'm still behind the action and I can still get a good subject track motion of this player diving to try to make a save as she slides throughout the frame, keeping focus on her face as she's moving. Then I've got another great shot of this player serving. This time she's on the left side and I can get a nice shot of her serving with her on the left side of the frame while the reaction is happening on the right side of the frame. This fifth burst is a bad example of what happens when eye control can't get onto your subject immediately. This typically happens when you're panning back and forth, as I was kind of mentioning in a few examples beforehand, especially in football, when you pan quickly to one side and you can't get that subject locked into place before the action happens. This is the downside to eye control shooting, but you can still get some cool creative shots as you're going throughout the game. So I still think it's a really awesome way to shoot, but a quick pan shot will be difficult to focus on. It's not always impossible, it just depends how fast the action is happening in front of you. All right, now to recap everything I've talked about and just discuss what my favorite focusing mode is for this camera and what settings that could be. So even with all the improvements that have been made into this camera, I think my still default capturing style is going to be using Servo, probably not subject tracking, and using a center point focus, either expanded area or a single point, depending on how much space I have and what I'm shooting. I am still going to use the eye control focusing method a lot, because what I began to realize is there's kind of two different ways of shooting with that new feature. So your typical way of shooting in the past, when you're not subject tracking and you're using a center point of focus, you're always trying to get action shots and you're constantly moving your camera all around and trying to make sure that you keep your subject fully and centered on your frame. But with eye control, it kind of allows you to do more creative style of shots, having your subject be tracked on the right side of the frame or the left side of the frame. What I have found is when you have to pan quickly with that method, it's much harder to make sure you get a quick focus versus just having a single point when you pan direct centered is in focus. This is highlighted by football, especially when you start off with the quarterback and you're trying to pan quickly to the wide receiver. You're gonna get a sharper, faster reaction time using center point, not tracking, so whatever your camera is directly looking at is in focus. Because what will happen is your camera will be centered and the software will find it before your eye does. When you're trying to use eye control, the best way of using eye control is when you can be a little bit further back, a little bit wider, and you don't have to whip your camera back and forth. So eye control really succeeds when you can slowly track your subject and keep them in your frame or your composition the entire time. You're not constantly searching for that back and forth with your camera. So what I do now going forward is I've got my camera programmed where I can hit a button to switch back and forth between the two throughout the game, because I don't just want your typical centered focus subject for every single shot. To kind of build a well-rounded portfolio, I'm going to want some creative shots and some storytelling shots. So what I like to do is when I start the game off, single point focus, no tracking, so that everything I kind of point and shoot at, I get locked into focus. And then once you hit off all of the photos that you need to complete the shoot, that's when you can switch over to your other setting, get some more creative shots, some more storytelling shots, use eye control to its maximum effort to get those unique angles and looks. But what I've been told is that method of shooting really struggles when you've got glasses, because you've got another layer of glass that the camera is trying to read your eye through. So it's a little unfair, but if you have to wear glasses while you're shooting, this way of shooting may not be you using eye control. But maybe if you use contacts, you won't have to worry about that problem because it's tracking the direction of your eye, not the actual direction of your eye through a pair of glasses. But I don't have contacts, I don't have glasses. I can definitely ask some fellow photographers how they feel about that to see what the best setting is for anyone that has to use glasses while they're photographing. I hope this review is overall helpful to you so you can understand what you're getting into when you get a Canon R3. I love this. It's really changed the amount of photos I can really get while I'm taking sports. I can now get that precise moment of action that I really want to with 30 frames per second versus 6 frames and 8 frames, which is what I was using earlier. If you have any more questions or comments about this camera, leave them down below and I'd love to answer them either in a few sentences or words, or maybe there's enough questions where I can make another video on those questions of this camera, because the more I can talk about this, the more I get to learn how to help you guys going forward. But as always, end of the video, let's recap.